Just trying to get the video playing so I can see the comments and stuff. It's acting really slow for some reason. There we go. All right, I think we got it. Yes, I have the Facebook video pulled up right now, and I can quickly go back and forth between the Zoom and Facebook. Yes, I have the Facebook video pulled up right now. All right. I guess we're live on the Facebooks, so we're gonna get started here. This is a bit of a different deleted scenes, and we're doing it. I'm here in Marcola, well, technically Springfield, I guess, but and then Pastor Matt is in his office. But this is deleted scenes. This is where we get together and talk about the most recent sermon that we had on Sunday, and so that would be Matt's sermon on love. And so I got to listen to that today, and I really enjoyed it. And so we have some questions. So we're going to go over those questions as part of this video. And you can actually comment any questions that you have for Pastor Matt in the comments section, and we will get to those as soon as we can.
Yeah, Pastor Jack is watching Facebook, and I'm watching YouTube. There is a little bit of a delay before we see them, but yeah, we'd love to answer your questions.
Yeah. So this one might be a little bit of a shorter deleted scenes. We're kind of, we typically go from like 30 to 40 minutes, and we're going to see how it goes of going a little bit shorter with these videos. And maybe sometimes conversation will just take us elsewhere, and we'll still go that long just with fewer questions. But I do have some questions for you, Pastor Matt.
Yeah. I like this. I feel like we're on a radio show.
Yeah, I know, right? First, this isn't really a question that I had planned on asking, but when you were preparing for this message, what was kind of going through your head? Because love is such a broad topic, and there's just so much that you could talk about. And the scripture that you had is one that's kind of, some people really love it, some people roll their eyes at it. And what was kind of going through your head as you were preparing for this message?
Well, so actually, this one it went a different route. So the way I started was I knew that I wanted to do 1 Corinthians because of the type of church that he's writing to and the situation they're in. So I knew that I wanted to cover 1 Corinthians. And originally I was going to cover a different chapter in 1 Corinthians. But when I started, it's funny how you'll have an idea and then you'll actually open the Bible and realize that it doesn't quite fit the way you were expecting, or it might not say what you were expecting. And so I basically had to go back to the drawing board in terms of figuring out, where does Paul really give them the solution to what they're dealing with? And so I looked at a bunch of different commentaries and how they structured the argument that Paul is making. And they actually just kept coming back to that passage as kind of the capstone of what Paul is saying, because he structures it at an important point and it encapsulates so much of what he's saying in other places. And so I didn't set out to write about love. Actually, originally, I think I was going to write about diversity. I was going to focus on chapter 12, where he talks about the structure of the body. But just my studies ended up telling me, no, he really wants us to focus on love. And that's ultimately the solution. Like, I had a notepad where I wrote, what is Paul's solution? And after looking through it, I said, well, it's love. it's this passage. So I guess we're going to dig into it and really see, how does this wedding passage actually help this church deal with their situations?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, you talk about this passage as a wedding passage, and this is
Yeah.
definitely one that you hear at a lot of weddings.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to ask, because you kind of talk about how this passage isn't specifically for that, right? I mean, it's actually not even really, it can be kind of involved in that, but it's not for that reason.
Hmm.
It's for love in general. And so I want to ask, is 1 Corinthians 13, is that a proper wedding scripture? If so, why? Or if not, what could be?
I've been thinking about that when I knew you were going to ask me. And I would say yes, absolutely, it is appropriate. I don't think the problem is that we shouldn't be using it at weddings. The more I think about it, the more I think the problem is we're not using it enough outside of weddings. Because it's a beautiful passage, and it does describe the way married people are supposed to love each other. So it's a fantastic way to set the tone for what love means in a wedding. That's great. The problem is that seems to be often the only place we hear about it, and so we think that's just a wedding passage, that's just about romantic love, and we don't use it often enough to guide our relationships with our friends or our coworkers, or and so we should just be using that passage all the time, and definitely at weddings. There are other passages you can use that will talk about the way, specifically how love works in marriages. They get a little bit touchy because that's not what they're talking about, and so you get into a lot of debatable issues about what gender roles are supposed to look like and stuff like that. So I think that it's definitely a good one to use. I'm not sure there is necessarily a better one.
Yeah. I was kind of thinking about this question that you just probably wouldn't have the answer to, because you wouldn't have been in the mind of these people that first started using this passage for wedding scriptures. But I think it's pretty safe to say that the original intention was, hey, this is a passage that's about love and how we're supposed to handle relationships. And this is obviously a relationship that we ought to use this idea of love in, and kind of started using that for weddings. And then all of a sudden that just became the wedding scripture. And that's kind of what people started to recognize it as.
That's very possible. I think another element of it is that people have probably been using it in weddings longer than we've had the modern view of what love is, the modern romantic view of love. For most of human history, you got married for reasons that mainly did not have to do with your feelings. You got married because you needed someone to help you run the farm. You got married because you needed to have a family. You had like 4 eligible people in your village to choose from, and you just married the people who were there. And it was about making it work. And it's only recently, very recently, that we've started making marriage about satisfying my warm and fuzzy feelings. So that's probably also part of it, that when they started using it at weddings, it didn't have that meaning, and we just kind of brought that into it later.
Sure. So don't forget, you can ask any questions that you have in the comments section, and we're paying attention to those as they would come in. As Pastor Matt mentioned, there is a bit of a delay, so we will get to those as soon as we can. So my next question here is this: what might we miss when we make the decision on whose gifts are valuable and whose gifts are not valuable? And maybe you have some sort of example that you might be able to bring for us to the table.
I think that there's a lot of things that can happen when you focus on the wrong gifts. Like, there are, nobody has all the same gifts. And so when you focus on maybe just what looks good up front in a church, you probably lose a lot of the gifts that help serve people, that help make a difference in your community. Every congregation, I think, probably has the thing they specialize in. I personally think that congregations also form kind of their own parts of the body to a certain degree. But you might come into a church that puts on a really good show, but nobody in the community knows that they're there because they're not helping people. Or you might have a church that's helping people, like that is serving them in terms of their material needs, but isn't really connecting them with Jesus. You could have, a church that suddenly you realize, wait a minute, nobody's actually taking care of the building, because we haven't been looking for people and using people with gifts of, maintaining the property and cleaning and those kind of things. So it's amazing how those things can get dropped. One thing that just to get very specific, one thing I'm looking forward to very soon is having a woman on staff with us, because they bring a whole different perspective that I don't have. And I'm glad we have different ages on our staff, because we can have a conversation and one of us will bring up something that nobody else thought about. So I think that's a really valuable thing too.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So my next question, the scripture that you were talking through is Paul, like, kind of listing a lot of these characteristics of love and what love looks like. And I wanted to ask, what do we learn about the concept of love from God, and where do we learn it from?
Well, the simple, easy answer is that we learn about the love of God. The first place would be from Jesus, and specifically the crucifixion, if you want to pick one point. And John says that in 1 John. This is how we know what love is, that Christ died for us. And so we see that modeled in Jesus and his life and ministry, his death and his resurrection. I think you also see it in the story, just the whole story of God's relationship with Israel. The way he is loyal to Israel and sticks with them through thick and thin, the way he is faithful to them, really demonstrates a lot of those principles. So the simplest, easiest place to start is the story of Jesus, is the gospel. And then once you start to recognize that, you can see it throughout the whole Bible and the way God behaves. The classic formula in the Old Testament for the attributes of God are he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Those are all, you could put all of those into this formula. You could find them in there, being forgiving, being compassionate, being, patient and slow to anger, and faithful. That steadfast love means faithful. Those are all things that they learned that originally came from when God forgave them for the golden calf. And you can see it right there, that they sinned and they abandoned him and he was faithful to them. All of that fits in with this definition of love.
Yeah. We'll only have a couple more questions here, so don't forget that you can comment any questions that you have in the comments section. We're paying attention to those as they come in. So my next question here is, you made the point that love is not self-serving, it is selfless, and I 100% agree with that. Definitely don't think you are wrong in that. But what I do want to ask is, where does mental health fit into loving others? Because I think sometimes I feel like we get caught in this cycle of just always serving others and loving others, and our mental health kind of seems to decline. So where does that fit into loving others in the selfless aspect?
That is a challenging question, because you kind of have to walk a tightrope of, you don't want to give people permission to be unloving for selfish reasons, but you also don't want people to run ragged. And actually, I think that really comes down to how people are going to respond to your advice. Because some people, when you say that it's important to maintain our mental health, they will take that as license to not love in ways that they really can. And then you have other people where if you don't tell them to take a break, they will run themselves into the ground and just, it'll be terrible for them. And that a lot, in a big way, has to do with how they respond. So I think what I would say is that the line where mental health and love meet is in a wisdom. I don't think it's a matter of limiting your love or putting love on the back burner, but I think it's a matter of developing biblical wisdom of knowing how best to love people. It's kind of like, if you have a pitcher of water and you want to give people water, if you're going to keep giving people water, at some point you have to turn around and fill the pitcher, right? So even if you're just focused on giving, you got to take a moment to fill the pitcher. And knowing that comes from wisdom, as opposed to giving yourself permission to just hoard your jug of water. I don't know if that works as a metaphor, but that's a matter of being able to think through what is the best, most effective way for me to actually love others, because people who run themselves into the ground, that's not good long term for loving anyway. And so I think that might also tie in, and wisdom ties in a lot with self-control, which we talked about in the previous sermon. Because I think those who are tempted to run themselves into the ground, first of all, I think that's a very good problem to have. I mean that says something very good about a person, that's the problem they're having. But I think there can also be a matter of having self-control to say, okay, I know I feel obligated to do this. I probably should say no at some point so that I can actually continue to help people.
Sure.
So, yeah, it's kind of a meandering answer, but I think it's a wisdom thing.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I have one more question. It I think is tied into this idea of self-control and maybe boundaries in a way. But this point down here that you talk about, reconciliation is impossible without vulnerability. And so I wanted to ask, what types of relationships should we have in our lives where vulnerability are vital? And then maybe kind of on the flip side of that, which relationships should we maybe limit our vulnerability with, and just create those healthy boundaries?
Yeah. As you ask this question, it makes me think about preaching. And there's a balance in preaching where you want to be transparent and you want to make yourself vulnerable. But if you get too much into your own vulnerability, then it becomes like a therapy session that you're working out in front of a captive audience. Like at a certain point, it just becomes about you. So you have to find that balance. I think that in every relationship that where there's reconciliation at stake requires vulnerability. I think it's the deeper the relationship, the more vulnerability it requires. So for instance, I think for me, when I preach, it requires some vulnerability to show people, to get people to understand what I'm saying, to believe that I mean what I say, to get them to hear, but not a ton, because I'm still speaking in public. And then maybe when I'm talking to someone one-on-one in the foyer, that might need a little bit more vulnerability, but it's not the same as the person that I've known for 5 years. And like my accountability partner, that's a different level of vulnerability. My wife is a different level of vulnerability. And if I go to the level of vulnerability with my wife when I'm talking to a person I just met in the church foyer, that's a problem. And if I'm only ever vulnerable with my wife to the same level I am a person I just met today, that's also a problem. So I think every relationship requires us to be vulnerable, but it's kind of proportionate to how intimate that relationship is.
Sure.
It's a matter of opening up to a level that shows people that you care and that they can know you on a deeper level. And really interact with you so that you're not holding them at arm's length.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that concludes all of my questions for today. And so just maybe to give the viewers, if they're watching and wanting to comment a question, a few moments to comment any questions they might have. Maybe you could preview a little bit of what you're talking about this next Sunday.
Yeah. Next Sunday, we're going to be in Romans. And this is the sermon that made me want to do the whole series. I originally was looking at doing just the book of Romans. Mm-hmm. And I realized that wasn't, it's the same thing where I opened the Bible and realized, oh, okay, it doesn't actually focus on this one topic all the way through the book. I think it does build up to it the whole time. But Romans is a book that we've for so long treated as just a big theological treatise. Like it's a big book of doctrine. If you want to know Paul's gospel, go to Romans and it has everything in it. That's not really how Romans works. It actually is missing a lot of really important things for Paul. And it's actually very focused on one particular issue that's really relevant to us today, which is How do you put together a church out of groups of people who disagree and don't have as much in common? And we're going to be focusing on Romans 14 and 15, which is the one passage that I have gone to more than any other in determining how we were going to handle all of the things, all the policy changes and all the things that have happened over the past 12 months. There have been an amazing number of times in the past 12 months when we as a staff have been faced with a decision that no one I know has ever had to make before. And like we have a lot of people with a lot of ministry experience here, but none of them have been through a pandemic. And we had to make a decision in, the next couple hours. We have to know what we're going to do. And in those moments, I tended to go back to Romans 14 and 15 to guide me. And so I find this to be a very, very practical passage and really, really helpful in those areas. And the principle, I haven't really, the name of the principle as, self-control, love, it's acceptance, which is the closest I can get to the Greek word that actually means a lot more than that. So you'll just have to listen to the sermon to find out what I mean by acceptance, or what Paul means by acceptance.
Sure. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure a lot of people at home are looking forward to it. It sounds incredibly applicable to today, how to put a church together with people with many differing opinions. So should be good. And I haven't seen any questions come in. And so I guess that will conclude our deleted scenes for today. We really appreciate you tuning in, and hopefully you can be with us next week. And Matt and I might be in the same room next week.
Yeah.
So
that's the goal.
But we're looking forward to it. So Pastor Matt, would you like to sign off for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. See you later, everybody.